Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 6. And this week and next week, so weeks 6 and 7, are really, it's two parts. And so I call it Assembling Evidence Part 1 this week. Next week, Assembling Evidence Part 2. And so let me get right into that, and hopefully that'll be clear where I'm coming from. Okay, so this is one of these weeks actually in the online environment where if we were in class, I'd probably handle this differently. So the first thing is this reminder that your problem statement of your project is due February 16th. That's Saturday. So I want to give you plenty of time to do a good job on that and work on that focus. So for that reason, there is not a discussion this week. That was the way I programmed the course and applied the grading numbers, was so that there wouldn't be a discussion this week. So if we were in the live environment in class, we would work on the discussion that I'm going to talk about at the end of this presentation. But be that as it may, I'd like you to engage your mind in some of the things I talk about towards the end of this particular presentation, even though I'm really not having you do a discussion or an exercise on that this week. So what I really want you to focus on in terms of graded activity for this week anyway is your policy problem statement. Okay, so set that aside for a second, and then we'll talk about this idea of gathering evidence, which is the term that Bartek uses. Okay, so the theme is assembling evidence. That's what Bartek says. And so notice that I don't say data. So, we have a difference between these terms, data, evidence, or data, information, and evidence. So data are, remember, observable facts, often produced from experiments, but often produced in real world experience. So data really are from the physical and social worlds. They might be numerical, but they don't have to be. And the key thing is that data is systematically collected, validated, and replicable. So any experiment that someone does, if it's not replicable, then it calls into question the methodology, right, of that experiment. It could also call into question the validity of the data. So data are typically raw and unprocessed, and data are typically not anecdotal. So you don't just observe, for example, that one person who smoked cigarettes died of lung cancer. That would be an anecdote. But in fact, the research on the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer has been conducted over very many years and has been conducted, much of it in laboratory conditions, so that by this time in 2019, most of us accept the proposition that cigarette smoking on a consistent basis could lead to lung cancer, right? Because it's data based. Information, on the other hand, it consists of data often, but it also consists of the interpretation of data, even unwittingly. And I'll get to that in a second. But information occurs as humans process data, right? So this idea of cigarette smoking, it is based on data, but we process information and then start to form value judgments about that data in terms of the information that we use in our day-to-day existence. And then evidence is data and information that are used to validate or invalidate an argument or arguments. So I'm going to kind of explicate these a little bit further. But the point is that we can use all of these things, right? Data, information, and evidence. They can all be subjected to various methodologies. And often they can be used really by opposing sides of a policy argument to support their arguments. Though this isn't always the case. Often advocates on opposing sides of a policy argument can employ the same data or the same information or the same evidence to make their points. So let's think through these terms. So I said data are not, they're often numeric, but they're not always numeric. So what's some examples? U.S. Census statistics on the population of the country, and each state compiled from the decennial census. So every 10 years, we do a census, right? And the purpose of the census, according to the Constitution, really is to apportion members of the House of Representatives. That was the constitutional purpose of the decennial census. It's a lot more than just counting people, human beings that live in every census tract, every congressional district of the country. There's a lot more useful data there, but that's its purpose. But the point is that the information is data. And so kind of hinting on next week, one important thing there is that even in the census data, there's different kinds of data. The decennial census population numbers, for example, are different than the American Community Survey population numbers. And we'll get to that next week and why that is. But it's important to keep in mind that there are variances in data because of sampling methodologies. So another example of data, number of traffic fatalities in Nebraska during 2015, or any year that you want to talk about, right? But if you actually looked at the traffic fatality data for Nebraska or any state, you would see that that's categorized into a lot of different kinds of data sets, which you can use to develop information, right? And so that information might lead you to believe, for example, that per mile driven, there are more fatalities that are caused when a driver is intoxicated versus when drivers are not intoxicated. List of hourly wages of fast food workers in Omaha during 2016. That's data, right? That doesn't, in and of itself, relate to anything unless you relate it to other wages. Range of scores on the GRE for students who enter the UNO MPA program. That's data that is collected. Then later, that data is often used to be predictive or to examine whether or not it is predictive. GDP growth rates over a specified time period. So how much does the economy grow over a specified time period? And here again, you can see that often people quote a quarter. So we quote the first quarter of 2019 or the last quarter of 2018, the GDP growth rate expressed as an annual percent, by the way. Often people say the economy grew at 4% this quarter. Not true. The economy grew at 4%, for example, expressed as an annual rate. If that quarterly growth rate were annual, that it would be 4%. But quoting the GDP growth rate for one quarter of 1 year is in fact data, but the question is it useful data? So if you really want to know how the economy is performing, you would probably want to look at a trend over a number of years, for example. Compiled results of a survey issued to county officials across Nebraska. That's data, right? As is interviews from some number of city managers in towns of less than 5,000 across Iowa. So now we're moving into qualitative data, right? Your interviews are also data, even though they are not numbers. So research that is most useful is data that is categorized into variables, that is, things that vary, right? And then we compare that using various methodologies. So classroom size data versus standardized test scores for fourth graders in Nebraska in some year in 2014. So we can categorize standardized test scores, and we can actually disaggregate that more by demographic data of the students, and we can compare that against classroom sizes in various districts. So you could obtain data on classroom sizes in various districts, and you can compare it to standardized test scores in various districts. And probably, if you had the data available, you could go down to the individual building school level. So, for example, answers to question 7 of your survey, right? Where you compare other variables about the survey participants to gender, age, ethnicity, level of education. So whatever you asked in question 7, of your survey that you issued to people, you can actually compare it to these other variables. So the number of traffic fatalities per number of alcohol impaired drivers, as I mentioned earlier. So data in and of itself, one piece of data is interesting, and it could be very meaningful, but typically we compare data across variables. So information. So as I said, this is data that are processed and used combined with other data to make information and judgments. So when your doctor says to you, in most cases, the pain in your knee that you have right now will decrease if you don't run for a week and use ice to reduce the swelling and ibuprofen for the pain. So what's that based on? That is actually based on medical research about the joint of the knee, right? But it's also based on that doctor's experience with dealing with people with knee issues. And it's based on what that doctor, what she might have asked you about your activities. Are you a runner? Or if you are overweight, or if other conditions apply. That doctor, in this case, is using all that information to make a judgment, right? There actually might be something more serious wrong with your knee, but the doctor is saying, based on the information we have right now, here's what I recommend. Please come back if the pain persists after you do what I asked you to do, right? So the color red is data. Red is a nominal piece of data, right? We categorize colors by how the light refracts, or whatever it is. So red is nominal data, right? So for some people though, who have color acuity problems, it might not be as apparent that red is different than green, for example, but still red is nominal data. But the color red on a traffic signal is information that tells you to come to a stop, right? But if you're a driver of a car, which I assume most of you are, you know that you're processing other information as you drive your vehicle, right? So you look ahead and you see that the light is yellow, you know it's about to turn red, so you're starting to slow down. What else are you doing? You might also actually look in your rearview mirror to make sure the car behind you is starting to slow down. You might even be doing that subconsciously. But the point is you're processing information, right? So if you drive on freeways or interstate highways, you know, especially in an urban area, that you're processing information all the time, right? You're looking at the speed of the car in front of you. You're looking slightly ahead of that car to see what the traffic's doing. Is it slowing down? Is it speeding up? You're using your mirrors to see if there is someone who is cutting in and out of lanes without using their turn signal, and you're processing all this information to make judgments. So I actually, as I was preparing this lecture for this week, I was listening to something on Marketplace, which I like to listen to, and I put this link here, which I'll have to get off the PowerPoint version of this. But there's some interesting policy implications of semi-autonomous and/or autonomous vehicles. So as we move into this technology of autonomous vehicles, what are the policy implications? And in fact, the point that this particular episode of Marketplace is talking about is perhaps the policy implications of semi-autonomous vehicles. So in fact, I drive a semi-autonomous vehicle, which means I have blind spot detectors in the mirrors of one of my cars. So, it flashes when somebody's in my blind spot on the left or right hand side. And that's based on, some algorithms and some technology built into the software that tell me to do that. But there's policy implications to that, right? What do we know, or what are we starting to learn about drivers through study who are driving semi-autonomous vehicles? And then further, what is that going to mean for public policy? I just think it's kind of an interesting use of science and data to lead to public policy. So information, items gathered by police and intelligence agency. It's often a combination of several sources of information, some of which might be data, right? So if you know anything about what the intelligence services of the United States do, they make an assessment. That assessment is based on some of its satellite imagery, some of it's based on tips, some of it's based on people who, Americans who work overseas, who develop social acquaintances with people of foreign countries and get information from them. So it's not, you could not call an intelligence assessment data, but you could call it information. The last example I give is the Zestimate, and probably you've all looked at this. Zillow has this thing called the Zestimate. If you look up an address in Omaha, it'll say our Zestimate for the sales price of this house is $249,000 or something. And so they say that's within a range, but that's based on an algorithm of various kinds of data, right? That include things like the county assessor's property valuation, market trends, how fast houses are selling in the area, how much they've sold for. So they use an algorithm really to develop information for a potential home buyer or a potential home seller to make a judgment. And so finally, evidence, right? Evidence does allow decision making. So in a court of law, for example, our standard for a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. However, our standard for civil law, that is, somebody's being sued, is preponderance of evidence. Two different standards, but they are both standards of evidence. And so what each of these asks the jury to do, or the judge, depending on the case, is to examine the evidence and then within their own intellectual capacity say, okay, the evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual committed this robbery, or the preponderance of evidence shows me that the plaintiff has a case and the defendant defrauded them of $5,000. But in those cases, what we're asking for is for a reasonably intelligent person to make a judgment call based on evidence. So policy debates in legislatures, for example, might rely on various kinds of evidence, right? So it might rely on data-based scientific research, right? So people who support evidence-based policymaking would tell you that we should always base most of our policy on solid scientific evidence for areas that we can apply scientific evidence to. But it's also based on other things, views of public administrators who implement various programs. So in fact, we know that legislatures call as witnesses directors of public agencies, right? So this happens at Congress, this happens at the state legislative level, where the committee says, I would like the director of corrections to appear and testify before us, right? In Congress, it is very routine for heads of executive departments to testify before Congress, for high-level executives in those departments to testify before Congress. And so they specifically do ask those sometimes appointed officials, sometimes civil servants, for their view on implementation of various programs. But other kinds of evidence, university researchers who might present research findings and testify before a legislature, or assessments of individuals or groups of clients affected by a particular policy. This is often the case in legislatures, right? Or budgets over a period of years. So, without anybody testifying, you could actually see budget trends over a period of years. So there's a lot of different kinds of evidence that are used by policymakers in the exercise of formulating policy. So in all those cases, we have to ask ourselves a few questions about the evidence or the information or the data. So is it real and not faked? I put an interesting link here. And you can, again, look at this on the PowerPoint side, but this is kind of a tragic story about a PhD student who faked data gathering, or by all appearances, faked data gathering. He contended he didn't. His university and his advisor said after examining the case that they believe he did. But it's an interesting case, uh, not for the least of which is that it talks about confirmation bias. Um, and if you read the study, you'll see what I mean. The author of this New Yorker article talks about confirmation bias on one side, but once the results came out of this supposedly faked research, there's confirmation bias really on the other side of this argument regarding gay marriage. So we also have to ask whether data or information was systematically gathered. So often, if you're doing survey data, are you using a large enough sample so that you're mitigating for bias? Or do you discuss some problems or limitations with bias? If you used a survey, was it sent to a sample of the population? That is, was your sampling correct and representative, or did you just send it to your friends? Or do you gather it just from a bunch of tweets from a bunch of people? There actually, there are a lot of researches. There is a lot of research. That was a weird construction. There is a lot of research based on social media gathering of data now, and it's proving to be pretty beneficial because there's so many people on social media. But I think we've also seen things like exit polls from voting polling places where we've seen problems with sampling. So is the source credible? That's the last question we have to ask ourselves. So if you're using a data source, would you consider it reliable? So is the source, for example, a partisan think tank or a researcher on the payroll of a lobbying organization? And can you compare this evidence to other evidence that has been produced? So this kind of brings me to this week's readings. So from the Bardak text, I asked you to read all of part 2. So pages 93 through 111, they're applicable, and I want you to read them. But that kind of assumes in that part that you might actually already be in the policy network, if you will, and that you might have a partisan bias. But I want to emphasize the idea that you don't have to be in that world. Bardak does actually, a part of his approach in the book is from that standpoint, which is fine. You just need to be aware of it. So the craft reading, it covers more than evidence assembling, but the last part of the reading is relevant, particularly figure 5.2, which I think I referred to earlier, because it talks about, once you start gathering evidence, it's kind of leading to the next part, which is, okay, so what's the intervention? What is it you want government to do? And the point is that as you're gathering data, you might already be pointing that direction. And for this classroom purpose, that's good to sort of put that on the back burner a little bit. The reason I had you do the exercise last week, and a lot of you made this comment on the statements of intent from the legislature, is that I think what some of you found is, in some cases, the statement of intent was really just a way of saying, I think the government should do this. I think the government should do this particular kind of intervention, a law or vouchers or something. And so it appears sometimes in the statements of intent that the legislator, the particular member of the unicameral, is not necessarily giving a statement of intent, but actually a justification for a particular intervention that they might think is useful. And so the last thing I wanted you to look at are some studies from the UNO Center for Public Affairs Research. So CPAR is a great asset of UNO. And so what CPAR does, among other things, and I'd like you to really look at their website, what CPAR does, among other things, is they provide policy briefs to the unicameral. And I'm asking you to look at some examples, but please explore CPAR for many more of their policy for their policy briefs, and look at the kinds of evidence that the authors assembled to support their findings. So for your purposes, for our purposes for the class, where's some places that you can get evidence? Well, there's print media sources that are typically searchable. So often in journalistic sources, you can search. Sometimes it's not. The New York Times is actually a really good source that's available from the library, searchable database of New York Times articles. Some not so much, unfortunately, like the Omaha World Herald or the Lincoln Journal Star. Sometimes there's a paywall associated with those. Various almanacs are pretty much all available online. And then there's, of course, academic journals. That link on the academic journals actually tells you the rank of various academic journals in public administration. However, that's not really the reason I gave it to you. I gave you that link so you can see kind of a long list of the journals in PA. But some of the more popular ones I list there, and these are good sources for you to use in your evidence assembly. And then, of course, there's federal government websites like the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Congressional Budget Office, the GAO, but there are others, and some of which we're going to talk about next week, like that are very good, like the Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. All three of those are really great sources of data and evidence that you can assemble for your project. And then there's state government websites. So last week we looked at the Nebraska legislature site, right? But there's also you can find from there the Legislative Research Office, the Legislative Fiscal Office, the Legislative Audit Office. So in any state, really, that kind of information is typically available. And then there's local government websites. So for example, cities do some do great jobs, some do not so great jobs at publishing their city budget, for example. But typically, for a good-sized city, you should be able to find budget data for several years. And then there are think tanks and partisan advocacy organizations. And then the books talk about interviews with the people involved in policy. So all these are great sources of assembling evidence. So talking about your own project specifically, your class project. So here's some tips that Bardet gives on assembling evidence, but they really apply to your project, which is 1, start early. In fact, you ought to be already doing that. 2, think about the value of various kinds of evidence to your effort. So what kind of evidence for this particular project is really going to be most useful? Because again, evidence comes in various categories. 3rd, you should be doing a literature review, that is of the academic journals, as well as a literature review possibly in journalistic sources or other sources. But you should be doing a literature review, and I ask you in the syllabus, I specify the number of references you should use. So you really ought to be starting your literature review now if you hadn't already. Understand what you already know. So this actually was involved in constructing your policy problem statement. There are things you already know about the issue, which is going to lead your efforts in these other areas. And then start making memos to yourself on what you know and what you're discovering as you start to assemble the evidence. So memos, really that just means taking notes on what you are discovering as you go along, however you do that. If you do it longhand in a notebook, if you have your own homegrown database that you use, just however you do that, you should be keeping track of the things you're discovering as you move along. And then here's some more practical steps. And this is a little redundant, but again, start with what you know and start making a memo. Make a memo to yourself on that and build from there. Again, this is redundant. When we talked about this, think about the value of sources. Are they relevant? Do they provide good information, and are they credible? And then the kinds of sources, documents and people, they can both be relevant. Um, you can alternate between documents and people. One source leads to another, and that's a really good tip for any kind of research. For example, when students do literature reviews, I always say, look at the bibliography or the reference list of that particular piece of literature. And it does build in an evidentiary way, and that kind of sounds like a police detective show, but it is. You are building evidence. And then the last one from the bar deck reading, the last part of the bar deck reading is political considerations. So for your purposes, that may or may not apply. Remember, you are actually in the simulation for the class representing a policymaker. So you may have a political bias, which is fine, but don't let your political bias get in the way of your evidence gathering, is my caveat. So, again, this is a little redundant to what I just said, but let me just zoom down here to the last bullet there. The evidence you assemble aids your entire process, but it does have to be credible and valid. It shouldn't just be anecdotes, and you have to be able to show where your evidence comes from. So that is to say, many students do enter into a policy analysis project with a particular point of view, and that's fine. What I'd ask you to do is make sure that your evidence is valid and credible. So, for example, 12 sources, which consist of editorials from Politico or the Wall Street Journal or the Omaha World Herald, I don't care where, but if your 12 sources were all editorials that said, we should do this policy and here's why, well, then you really don't have credible sources. Editorials are not necessarily credible sources unless you're studying what various parts of the media seem to support. But that's not what your study is. Your study is on policy. So here's the part of the exercise this week that I said, if I were in class, we'd do this in class as an exercise, but I'm having you concentrate on your problem statement this week. So I'm asking you to do this because it's actually going to help you when it comes to your own evidence assembling effort. So I've asked you to look at the Center for Public Affairs Research. This is a screenshot. I gave you the link for the CPAR homepage, and this is what will pop up. It might not have that map because it actually, the map keeps cycling through other different displays, but this is their homepage. That's a screenshot. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So this is actually the Nebraska State Policy Initiative, because CPAR has several different little branches. This is one of their initiatives. It's called the Nebraska State Policy Initiative. I really like this policy initiative. What this is about is, and I highlighted this in yellow, it won't appear in yellow there, but on your screen, but the Nebraska State Policy Initiative brings evidence to bear on pressing state government issues through a joint initiative with the Nebraska Legislature's Planning Committee and the University of Nebraska at Omaha's College of Public Affairs and Community Service. Researchers affiliated with the Center for Public Affairs Research use data to identify issues of growing concern for the Nebraska Legislature and present practical alternatives for consideration. CPAR is nonpartisan and does not recommend policies to the legislature, but rather provides objective information on state issues so that informed decisions can be made. Okay, so what CPAR does, or what the Nebraska State Policy Initiative is about, is a series of policy briefs, all of which stop short of recommending a solution to particular policy problems. And so this is actually a great example of how the university provides service to the state, because members of the legislature can use these. Actually, anybody in the public can use them, but at least once a year, CPAR provides a presentation to the executive committee of the legislature on issues of pressing or timely concern. And so I'm asking you to look at some of these briefs this week. So if you clicked on that and you scroll down the page, you can scroll down to the middle there and it says policy briefs right there. And so you can see that there's these 9 categories of policy briefs that are published by CPAR. And so what I'd like you to do at this point in the exercise is I'd like you to scroll through some areas of interest for you. I mean, it might be agriculture, the economy, education. And in every one of these areas, there are several policy briefs, most of which probably are written by faculty from UNO, from various parts of the university, not just CPACs, by the way, but various parts of the university. So what these policy briefs do is they examine some evidence, and in many cases, they suggest policy alternatives. What they don't do specifically, and what you will do in your own policy brief, is provide a recommended solution. These don't do that. But what I'd like you to do is on the next page of my slide here. Okay, so I say an intellectual exercise, not a discussion. This was a discussion question in a previous time that I taught the class, and this would be our focus in class if we were live. But what I'd like you to do, because it's going to help you in your own assembly of evidence, is I'd like you to look at these policy briefs and start thinking through this. What kinds of evidence do the authors of the studies use to support their findings? That's a question. Do you think this evidence is appropriate for the study, and could this evidence be improved upon, or how? Do you think the evidence assembled is valid and credible? And could validity and credibility be improved upon? And in general, what's your view of the utility of the study you read? So that is, do you think the policymakers could make use of it? And how could they apply this to their own policy purposes? So contrast this thinking on these studies with the statements of intent that I had you look at last week, and try to figure out if these are a little more useful. I mean, I think you would find them a little more useful. However, it's possible that sometimes when legislators write statements of intent, there's an assumption there that their colleagues in the legislature already know the issue. They may have read, for example, a policy brief on agricultural property taxes. And so they have all this information available to them, and the legislator themselves simply skips to the step of saying, therefore, we should do this. So that's kind of a question that I wanted to really to sort of get you thinking about with my question last week on statements of intent. So again, this is not a discussion because I'm having you focus on your policy problem statement this week, but this is a great exercise for you to do, and these policy briefs published by CPAR are really good examples of how evidence can be gathered to support a list of policy alternatives. So thanks. I'm looking forward to reading your problem statements. Thank you.